I thought that my outfit for this review would sort of fit the review that I'm actually doing in terms of a gimmick. I know this whole week I've done those ridiculous sketches and filters and all that sort of stuff. I mean, I could show you it snowing outside. I guess that would relate to them being like where they're from or this album thematically. I don't know. I thought the stupid bullshit you guys had to put up with this week, I just wanted to kind of end it a little bit more relaxed and calm, just like this album in a lot of ways and all that. So we're just gonna get straight into it. Hey everybody, ChannelBK, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining me for another great classics week, and we are gonna finish with a very strong album from Sigur Rós. Sigur Rós is a famed Icelandic post-rock group. This is their third studio album. You could call it the Bracket album, you can call it the Untitled album. I'm just gonna call it the third studio album, as well as all the tracks on here, mainly just because it'll be easier for me to consider them movements, because that's kind of what I consider them on this album. Obviously, this being their third studio album, they followed up their second album, which sort of put them on the map in terms of huge post-rock groups. I think this is a great album. I think it's very, very great. I think it was a huge statement from the group. I think it showed how great their textures were. I think it showed a fact that, you know, again, as a foreign group, it could still be compelling, mainly because of the instrumentation, but also because of Jonesy's incredible vocal delivery, his very boyish, whimsical, but powerful delivery. And I think it's a very bold statement from the group. Everyone talks about it being an incredible album, but this album is the album that follows it up. And on this album, they actually were even more experimental. Like I said, all 8 of the songs on here are basically untitled. They sang the whole entire album, or Jonesy sang the whole entire album in this Hopelandic speak, which is a made-up language to them. It's sort of just a bunch of sounds and made-up words that they sing on here. This is something that they've done throughout their career, but not to the extreme lengths that they did it on here. And for an album that is that experimental with untitled tracks, with Jonesy singing in this Hopelandic speak, and for the album to sort of be a lot more softer, a lot more slow building, a lot more of something that you have to kind of sit and be patient with, I think it's a very impressive feat if you're willing to go into it with that. Because in a lot of ways, I think that this album sort of influenced what they sort of done later down the road. Obviously, this album is definitely not as catchy or mainstream as their follow-up to this album. I think that obviously is the album that sort of broke them into a more mainstream success, or something like Valtari or Quaker down the road, which obviously had, you know, a more ambient sound on one and a more darker sound on the other. I think there's actually a lot of that stuff brought up on this album that you see further down the road, and I think it influenced what they did later down the road. But I think this album, again, like I was saying, is a more slow burn. It's something that you have to be patient with. It's not an album you should get into right away for Sigur Rós. I think obviously you should get into one of their later albums or even the album before this, but I think this album experimentally is one of the most rewarding albums for them in terms of the subtleties that they do. Ken Thomas, who produced their last record, came in to produce this record as well, and the thing that I like so much about it is how they split up both halves in a way. The first half is a little bit more hopeful, it's a little lighter, it's a little brighter. The second half of the album is a little bit more melancholic, it's a little darker, it's a little bleaker. But it's funny because as I get into the review, I don't really think that completely about both halves. I think there's definitely things that share similarities with the first half that are a little darker, and the second half that is a little bit brighter. I think one of the things that I liked about the split though is how the first side is a little bit more piano based, a little bit less guitars. I think they experiment with Jonesy's vocals a lot more. It's a little bit more distorted and they sort of sample it a lot differently, whereas the second one has a lot more booming drums and it's heavier and there's a lot more guitar basses, and there's also a lot more in terms of progression and building to these huge climactic moments. We start off with the first track on here. Again, very soft piano. It's a very somber track. Jonesy comes in about the second half of the track, and again, his vocal delivery is again stunning. I'm going to probably talk about that a bunch on this album, but the way they sample his vocals and the way they sort of distort them and layer them is really interesting. Again, this is a very simple track. Again, the pianos are really the main drive of this song, and it's a very interesting opening to the album to sort of hypnotically get you sucked in. The second movement here feels a little bit more distorted. There's a little bit slower building percussion and cymbals and snare clicks. I also like the sort of hypnotic guitars that are layered on this track as well. Again, this is the first time that we see something that is a little bit more lively than just some slow pianos and some sort of vocal harmonies singing in the background. The third movement on here is one of the more ballsier ones on here. I love the twinkling pianos. There's no vocals from Jonesy at all. I mean, there's definitely harmonies that you can kind of hear sometimes in the background, but it's mainly instrumental only. I love the twinkling pianos. It feels, again, very gorgeous and beautiful. I love the strings that build near sort of the second half of the track as well. And I also love the added bells that get added again. They start very minimal, you only hear it every once in a while, and then it gets a little bit more prominent near, again, the second half of the track. And the fourth movement to end the first side of this album has a little bit more of kind of a marching, deep percussion line. Again, I love the guitars on here. They're very atmospheric in the background. I love the sound of them. Again, this is a track that sort of starts building you now into the second half of the album. And again, this is something that I was talking about, that there are elements of both sides that sort of fall into each other's side as well. The fifth movement has some very hypnotic keys. Again, hypnotic, atmospheric. Two words that completely describe this album in a nutshell. Very hypnotic keys. I love the minimal drums that build in throughout the track. I think Jonesy's falsetto is absolutely beautiful and gorgeous on here. Again, just like the rest of the album, I love the way he just delivers this sort of, again, made up language and speak, because he does it in a way where you can interpret your own lyrics for it. But again, unlike the first half, there's a difference to the second half. And the second half of this album has a lot more building tension. By the last leg of the track, it gets big, gargantuan, it gets huge, and all the instrumentation builds in together. The sixth movement on here actually shares a lot of similarities with the fourth. It opens with this marching deep percussion line, but it's a lot more sinister. Obviously, from the name of the track, the EBO, they use a electronic string resonator on the bass, so it kind of adds that atmospheric tension to it. But once again, there's just a build and build until the final 2 minutes of the track where it just roars to these big heights. And then we get to the seventh movement on here, which is actually the longest track on here. And the thing that I love so much about this song is sort of the build each time. It feels like just a very long song in terms of the structure. Jonesy sings these sort of somber lyrics, and it feels very somber, and then it builds to him just soaring these vocals out. It's beautiful, and it goes into this big build, and then it slows down, and then it does it again, and then by the end of the song, it's huge and gargantuan, and it just feels epic. And again, it just feels like it's just one really long song stretched out, unlike a lot of the songs on here, which feels sort of one note, or again, where they do a lot more interesting things with the whole verse chorus thing. This feels a lot more natural in a way, even though it's like the longest song on here. And then the final track on here, which again, is very surprising to me that this is on sort of the dark side of here, but I guess it maybe helps being the finale of this album. It's the second longest song on here. In translation, it's called the pop song, which seems like it because it starts with this great guitar opening, but then it's basically led by these really great drums, but then they get like very punchy throughout the song. I really liked it. And then the second half of the track does something that obviously not a lot of the tracks on here do, which it actually speeds up in tempo. It gets very great. I love just the huge drum solo at the very finale of this track. It adds this epic finale to the whole entire album. And again, it changes up what the rest of these movements or songs did, which I think it does a lot of very different, interesting elements, which again, I feel like a lot of people listening to the album might be a little bit kind of like, oh, this is slow, blah, blah, blah. And I think this adds a little bit more intensity to the album. But again, this album is honestly for patient listeners. I think it is a lot softer, it's a lot more slower, and it has a more slow burn than a lot of their records in their discography. But honestly, at the end of the day, I think this album was such an important statement for the group, because I think in terms of what this album meant for them down the road, in terms of them being a little bit more ambient, in terms of them being a little bit more experimental, I think this album has a lot to say about the group's discography. Again, I think it's this whole idea where their second album was very huge and epic. I love the structure of that album. It's incredible. But I think what this album did was stripped away a lot of that and went a lot more simpler, but also a lot more experimental, because I think you have to be patient with it. And it's very, again, you don't know what any of the lyrics are because it's just kind of sounds. You can take your own interpretations of it. I think it's very interesting and beautiful. It's just these 8 pieces of music that, again, if you're willing to sit through it, I think it's a wonderful experience. I think it's a wonderful sound, and I think Sigur Rós really outdid themselves. And again, this is easily one of, if not their most experimental album they've ever done. And I say, if you definitely have the time to listen to it, this is a fantastic post-rock record. And again, Sigur Rós in general is great, but I think this is such a big moment for them in terms of making it big and sort of having that big album, and then them sort of doing kind of a Kid A, I guess, which is they kind of went back and like, no, we're gonna make something a little simpler in a way, but it's also a lot more daring than their last album because it's a lot more patient. It's not something that you could just pick up with right away. You have to kind of let it flow and just sit with you. And that's why it's a great album. That's why it's a classic, and that's why I reviewed it. But if you listen to it, what did you think of it? Leave it in the comments below. If you like Sigur Rós, tell me where this ranks amongst their albums. If you please like and please subscribe. Classics Week. We're done again. I can't wait to do more Classics Week, excuse me, and I'm very excited to hopefully get something going. I know I say this all the time, but don't worry, I think something will happen. But you know where to find me at the end of the year and with Classics Week. So thank you guys so much for watching. Watch all the other classic reviews. Thank you for tuning into Channel BK. Peace out, guys.